Hello, welcome to Unit 2 of our course. I look forward to working with you during this unit. This unit will focus on the United States in the late 19th century, and the period from 1880 to the turn of the century in 1900. Specifically, we'll be focusing on two major trends in American history: the arrival of large numbers of immigrants into the United States during the time period, and also we will be focusing on the emergence of the United States as a great world power militarily. Specifically, we will be examining the Spanish-American War. In terms of immigration, from 1880 to 1900, approximately 14 million immigrants arrived in the United States. The bulk of these immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, from the southern part of Italy, and from the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Most of those coming to the United States in the period from 1880 to 1900 were seeking economic opportunity. They largely were leaving areas that were deeply impoverished in Europe at the time, in the hopes that they could make a better life for their family in the United States. The bulk of the immigrants to the United States during this period were either Roman Catholic or Jewish from Eastern Europe, and this represented a religious shift in the United States. Prior to 1880, the vast majority of the population in the United States were members of various Protestant Christian churches. With the arrival of immigrants from 1880 to 1900, there's a substantial increase in both the Catholic and Jewish population of the United States. Hence, the United States became a nation that was more diverse both ethnically and religiously. The immigrants who came to the United States in the period from 1880 to 1900 largely were processed at a facility on Ellis Island. Ellis Island is an artificial island in New York Harbor. It was created by essentially dumping fill and debris in the harbor. And on this artificial island was built an immigration processing center. So when immigrants arrived to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe, the ships first stopped at Ellis Island, and the newly arrived individuals would go through what could at times be a somewhat frightening experience at Ellis Island. Most of the arriving immigrants, of course, did not speak English. Most were not literate because there weren't public schools or educational systems in the regions that they were coming from. And they were confronted by a bureaucratic process that was necessary to complete to enter the United States. Most had sold everything that they had in their homeland in Europe and brought over just a few bags of clothing and other goods that they had. During the processing, they would be asked their names, and their names would be officially registered. Many of the immigration authorities did not know how to spell their names, so that's why you see this huge diversity in spelling of names from Eastern Europe. They wrote their names however they felt they sounded. Most of the immigrants themselves weren't literate, so they didn't know the spelling of their own names either. They would go through a cursory medical inspection. This was basically to discover whether any of the individuals arriving suffered from infectious diseases. Assuming that this quick medical inspection didn't reveal any concerns, they would be marked on chalk in their clothing that they were good to pass through. If there were any concerns, a chalk marker would be placed and they'd be sent to a secondary screening process to look at whatever was of concern. Approximately 2% of the immigrants who arrived in the United States through Ellis Island were denied admission, largely based on medical concerns. Now, some individuals who suffered from conditions that were curable were sent to a hospital that existed on Ellis Island. There was a hospital on Ellis Island for newly arrived immigrants, and if they suffered from a medical condition that would likely either clear up on its own or could be cured, they immigrants would be sent there for a period of time, and then when they no longer suffered from the infectious disease, would be allowed to enter the country. But roughly 2% of immigrants were sent back to their home country. The shipping companies themselves were forced to pay the cost of returning immigrants to their home country, ultimately. This was devastating for those involved. This was, in many cases, a desperate effort to start a new life. It could also be very challenging. Families could be split apart, which could be devastating, of course. Um, Imagine that you are a newly arrived immigrant family from Eastern Europe, and one member of your family is taken away for additional screening, but you may not even know why they're taken out of line, taken away, or when or if they're going to be released or be able to reunite with you. Um, there were generally relatively few restrictions on entry to the United States during this period. Um, Large numbers of immigrants were welcomed into the United States during this period. There weren't a lot of laws prohibiting the entry of immigrants during the period. The United States was undergoing tremendous industrial growth in the late 19th century, and there was a great need for workers, for laborers, and many of the newly arrived immigrants would be working in industry. Most settled on either the East Coast or the Midwest in urban areas. There were exceptions to this, but this was generally the case. Um, you had large numbers of immigrants settling in New York City, some moving out to other industrial cities in the Northeast, and some moving by rail typically to industrial cities in the Midwest as well. So this tended to be the pattern. Unfortunately, there was hostility towards immigrants in the late 19th century, much as there is today, unfortunately and tragically. Um, why was there hostility towards immigrants in the late 19th century? I think for many of the same reasons that you see hostility today. Many people were fearful or um, uncertain about the new arrivals. Um, they were members of ethnic and religious groups that many Americans were not familiar with. Um, and there was hostility, racism, and bigotry directed towards the newly arrived immigrants. There were organizations that called for restrictions on immigration at the time. Um, there were individuals who attacked the religious backgrounds of the immigrants. Some claimed that Catholic immigrants were part of a vast conspiracy organized by the Pope to conquer America. This, of course, was not true. There's no basis in fact for this, but it was a common belief at the time. There was also a great deal of anti-Semitism at the time, hostility towards Jews, that was deeply rooted in America. And so Jewish immigrants also faced discrimination and bigotry. In spite of this, many immigrants did find opportunity to start a new life in the United States. Now, the second theme for this week deals with the United States emerging as a global power, and the United States was becoming a great military power in the late 19th century. This was first dramatically expressed, really, by the Spanish-American War. Cuba was still a colony of Spain in the late 19th century, but individuals in Cuba had been fighting for independence for a few decades at this point. Many people in Cuba felt that they were oppressed by Spanish rule and by the Spanish government, and I think there's a good that this was true to a great extent, that many people in Cuba were oppressed by the Spanish government. And so there was an independence movement in Spain, in Cuba, I should say, against Spain. The United States ultimately became involved in this in 1898. The United States was concerned about its own economic interests in Cuba, and the United States government sent a battleship, the Maine, to Havana Harbor. When the ship blew up mysteriously, the United States government concluded that it was the Spanish who had destroyed the ship with a mine. Later investigations seemed to suggest that this was not the case, but that was the widespread belief at the time. In response, the United States declared war against Spain and launched an invasion of Cuba to liberate Cuba from Spanish rule. Excuse me. At the same time, the United States Navy attacked the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay in the Philippines and destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Pacific. And the United States proceeded to invade the Spanish possession of the Philippine Islands as well. The United States in a few months defeated the Spanish. The Spanish Empire was in decline by this point, and the United States effectively at this point found itself in possession of several Spanish colonies, former Spanish colonies, namely Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippine Islands, and Guam. There was debate in the United States Congress about what to do with these territories. The United States ultimately granted independence to the island of Cuba, although this was somewhat of a false independence. The United States continued to exert tremendous control and influence over the island of Cuba for the following many decades. The United States took possession of Puerto Rico as a territory of the United States, and it remains a territory of the United States today. And the United States took possession of Guam and the Philippine Islands as territories of the United States. The Philippine Islands were granted independence in 1946. There was concern that the United States was becoming an empire at this time, and that this conflicted with American principles and ideals. You have 2 assignments to complete for this week. You're asked to participate in a discussion board related to domestic developments within the United States in the late 19th century. And you're asked to complete a blog post, a short written assignment regarding the rise of the United States as a global power during this period. They're very similar in formats to the assignments that you completed for Unit 1. I look forward to participating in this unit with you on the discussion board. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Email is usually the best way to reach me, although you do also have my phone number as well if needed. And I hope that this will be an interesting unit. Thank you.